Hi, I'm Bill, the domestic monk. Welcome back to the second part of my fascinating interview with Brian Hoyland about his near-death experience in 2017. In case you missed it, you can watch part one, which focused on the suffering Brian endured during the years and months leading up to his NDE. All right, so Brian, when we last spoke, you gave us the first part of your story, what I'm calling the life of Job. And at the end of that, you told us how your soul popped out of your body, and that's where we left it. Take it from there.
Okay. It's funny you call it the life of Job because that's how I really related well to him during this whole ordeal. Of course, where we left off gets to be a wonderful blessing. So it's funny how even the worst suffering, when you put your trust in God, can lead to some really beautiful experiences. And so I felt this shake and this pop, and I snapped out of my body. And at this point, I was in a dark void, like a tunnel almost.
I'm sorry, Brian, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I want to ask you something here. So this is really a point of emphasis in your book. From the moment you popped out of your body until the moment you popped back, you never lost consciousness. In fact, you felt more conscious than ever. Is that right?
It couldn't be further from that. Like you said, I never lost consciousness. This is the most incredible part of it all because I remember the point of dying. I remember the experience of dying. I remember what happened while I was dead and then coming back. All of that without any kind of interruption, a full scene. I mean, this was just full length experience without any interruptions or a break in the pattern. And in fact, what's really impressive is that my memory is so much better of that experience than even the beginning. Right before I died, I have gaps in my memory, just like anyone does for any other experience in their life. And when I came back, I have gaps in my memory. But that entire experience of when I was dead and my brain was not functioning, I have no gaps. I have no missing pieces to that experience.
Wow.
That's all while my brain was dead. So you can't convince me, nor does the research actually prove that. So I mean, people talk about all kinds of chemicals like DMT and other things. It's not even the same thing. They're trying to compare apples to oranges. This is complete, and your body doesn't produce enough of that to be able to withstand that kind of a length of time with no brain activity. It's just impossible for the organism to work like that. Yet people want to hold on to it because they don't want to believe the alternative, which is you've got a supernatural life that you're going to face, and you can either go one direction or the other. And people don't like to have to choose to go to the bad direction because of the life that they have chosen to live.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's incredible. Hey, touch on that for a minute, if you don't mind, before you head into the actual NDE. So obviously, this is the first time that you died. I mean, you had some close calls. You were really dealing with some significant health issues for the 5 or 6 months leading up to this event. But what's it like? Some people, they're driving down the road and they have an accident and they don't have any time to prepare for this. But you were in that emergency room. You're just a normal guy and you're dying. What's that like?
That part was, there was terror to it. There was, I think the ICU has always been a terrorizing place to me because there's people dying all the time. I mean, it's the ICU. You only go there when you're in very serious condition. So it's a place I've never been comfortable with. I don't really care for the hospital very much, but knowing you're going to die, it's nice to have that heads up. I mean, if we all knew what time we're going to die and when it's going to happen, what a blessing that would be. I really do look at getting that advance notice as being one of the greatest things I've ever had in my gifts I've ever been given in my life, because I was able to not take for granted that little bit of time I had left. I think we waste so much of our time on stupid, frivolous activities that don't produce anything for our soul. And I was able to mitigate some of that because of this foreknowledge of, hey, you're going to die in the next few hours or maybe a day, or I knew it was coming. I didn't know how long it would be. But, when you're under that kind of duress physically, and you realize that your time's coming to an end, you make the most of it.
Yeah.
So there was a blessing to that. But dying itself was fantastic. There was, once I was dead and I'm in that dark void, or I wasn't necessarily in the dark void. I was in this tunnel that was attached to the dark void. But like all the sound, all the chaos of that hospital room was immediately gone. All the fear, all that stuff was gone. There was no more emotion like anger or sadness or, that fear, that just overwhelming, oppressive fear. Everything was gone. It couldn't even exist to me at this point. And that was a beautiful thing. So it wasn't like death brought this kind of horror. Of course, I think if I would have gone to hell, that would have been a terrorizing experience. It wasn't there. So my experience was just this immediate flood of joy and love and peace. And it was quite beautiful. It was something that just healed my soul that had been fighting along with my body this whole entire period. And quite honestly, leading up to my death was really, there was a lot of uncertainties. There was a lot of, questions like, did I live a good life? And I don't know how many other people might have had those thoughts, but I didn't have a lot of thoughts about, am I living a good life? I really took a lot for granted. I thought, I'm a good person. I do these good human things, and I'm not murdering people. I'm not doing all these other evil things, so I must be okay.
Yeah.
But the reality is, I wasn't living for God. I was living for myself first and foremost. No matter how much I thought I was doing good, it was usually because I believed in that. I believed in honor and integrity. I believed in doing good to other people as long as they're not stabbing me. If they're stabbing me now, it's game over for them, right? It's like I turn into a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of guy because it's about me first, and we're complex that way. We really have to work hard to be able to sacrifice our own ego and our own desires for what's greater. And, God doesn't want us running around acting on our own accord all the time. He wants us to be loving and caring, and it doesn't mean we're doormats, but at the same time, how many of us are willing to act on our own behalf before it even comes to a point of being a doormat? We just don't want to be inconvenienced.
That's a great point you're making. Because I'm like you, I'm a 60-year-old guy. I've tried to live a good life. I've served my country. I've served my community. But at some point, I really started looking at my life. And I take our Catholic faith seriously. And a couple of things have really been turning points for me. One is the universal call to holiness, right? We are all called to be holy. Well, when I understood that it wasn't just for priests or bishops, but it's for me too, that was eye-opening for me. And I hope we can get into that a little bit in your story, the parable of the sheep and the goats. When I realized, and that's what's fascinating about talking to someone like you, that we all have a judgment coming. We're all going to be, we're going to be evaluated. Our life's going to be scrutinized. When I started trying to imagine what that's going to be like, that puts things in a completely different perspective. It forces us to kind of peel off all those justifications we have. You start to explore, hey, I better turn this ship around, right?
Right. Well, wait till we get to that part, because I think that's something that you're definitely going to get the answers to, because I experienced that.
Yeah.
And the way that it happened, I think, you're already touching on so many of the points of it. Yeah, I think that we often will be surprised. I know I was by how it took place and how serious I was about things I wasn't serious about before. My whole perspective changed because now, while I'm in this dark valley or tunnel or whatever, I realized that there was no temptations either. There wasn't these negative emotions, but there were no temptations. I was thinking more clearly than I could have ever imagined thinking. I had so much, like, this infusion of knowledge that just overtook all of my previous conceptions of any kind of knowledge. And being able to see things in a way that, I think was much closer to the way God sees things. I certainly wasn't to his level of by any stretch of the imagination, but I wasn't looking at things from my perspective any longer.
Yeah.
I was looking at them from very high scrutiny over the things that I had done. And so, it changes everything, and being in his presence.
And so that's really it, right? Like, I've always thought that's what judgment is. We no longer see ourselves as we see ourselves. We see ourselves as Christ sees us, right? All right, let's get back to the story. So you pop out of your body, you're in this tunnel or you're in this void. What happens next?
All right. So, like I said, all the sound and the pain, all the emotions, everything's gone. It's replaced by this love and this peace and this joy, and it was overwhelmingly loving. And I'm looking at this emptiness, this complete kind of like outer space, but without any luminous beings. There's no stars, sun, no moon, nothing up there. It was just pitch black. And I'm looking at this, and I felt this draw, like this idea, and everything. It was intellectual, so my mind was working at a pace far faster than I could ever have imagined. It was literally as if I had every memory, experience, thought I've ever had in my entire life at my disposal, where I could just focus on any of that. But not just mine. Of everything that had ever happened, there wasn't. It didn't seem as if anything was hidden from me, as if all this knowledge was there. I really wasn't interested in all of it because there was so much of it, but it was all playing out. And what I focused on was what I ended up bringing back. And at this point, I'm focusing on this darkness and this feeling that I'm getting, and how I just left this horrific experience, and it's now replaced with this love. And I had this inclination that just sit back and enjoy this love. This is what it's like now. And I knew that this wasn't coming from the love. This was separate kind of inspiration. The love itself wasn't trying to seduce me or trying to do anything. It was just loving me. It was actually action that was happening to me. And yet this other part of me was trying to get me to just relax and just soak in this experience, without what my heart really wanted when I was dying was to find Jesus, to be with him. And that's all I wanted. I remember this thought that, and it was a deep layered thought, but it was that I don't even want this love and this joy and this peace right here, and this, all the pain gone, all the chaos gone, and just sitting here staring at this dark void with this wonderful feeling, if Jesus isn't there. I didn't even want that. And it was so deep. This thought was playing out all the possibilities. So it wasn't just, kind of having this random thought, but it was all the possibilities that are connected with that. And that's when I realized I could see into this darkness, to this dark void. I could see the depth of it. I could see how deep it was. I couldn't see anything in it, but I could see that it was this vast emptiness. And later on, when I come back from my story, I'll explain a little bit more of what I think that entails. But I really look at it as, this is what I was bringing to heaven, was a vast amount of emptiness, nothing of real value. And to stay there, I really think was something that was trying to draw me into just my own same self-determining beliefs, to just care about myself, nothing else, put everything else aside. Even though I just died begging for Jesus to be with me and wanting nothing but him and willing to give that up, this was almost as if it was trying to get me to forget about that. But I didn't. And when I realized that I was looking into this darkness, it was because I could see light. And the light wasn't coming from the darkness, it was behind me. And I could see that this darkness was being penetrated by this light. And I was able to see into it. And this light was where the love and the joy and the peace was coming from. And so I wanted to be with the light. So I turned, which, I still don't know why I turned, because I could see the light behind me. When I turned to the right, but I could still see the dark void the entire time. So when I was turning it never left my view. I could still see it. And of course, I'm focusing on the light, so I don't have the greatest memory of, maybe there were some things popping out and like trying to grab, who knows what they were doing back there. But I had no concern over that. I had concern on the light. So I could still see that I could see it, and I knew that it was in my sight, but it just wasn't what I focused on at this point. And so, turning to the right, I think, when you mentioned about the sheep and the goats, I kind of, one of those times, where the sheep, they know God's voice. You know, when you belong to him and you're really trying to hear his voice, you're going to know that it's different than whatever it was that was trying to get me to stay there. Because whatever was trying to get me to stay there didn't want me to go to the light. And that's where that love was coming from. That's where I eventually find God. But it wanted me to stay there. And no matter how much I was basking in God's love, because that's where it was coming from, it was trying to hijack that experience to get me to not actually be with the origin of that love.
It was like a subtle deception.
Very much, very subtle and crafty. The beautiful thing was that I had this increased intelligence, so I wasn't like my old self where I'm easily fooled into stupid temptations. And this, I had some sort of a combat, but I think it was more because that love was helping to instruct me, not forcing me in any way, but gently calling me. It was so pure that it was clear distinction between its voice and the voice of that darkness.
I wonder if some people just choose to stay in that void.
Yeah, I don't know. I have this sinking reservation of what could be in there. I have my own ideas about it. I didn't go in there, so I don't want to speculate too much because it's just speculation. However, having stood in front of it, I think my speculation is maybe better than somebody who hadn't stood in front of it.
Yeah.
I would never go in there. If, when you die, if you see that same thing, you might, go straight to heaven. Maybe you won't have to go to this point. I don't know how it's going to be for everyone else. But I very much hope people hear this story and say, let's get away from that darkness as quickly as we can and get to the light.
Yeah. It definitely wasn't what you were drawn to.
Definitely not. And it had nothing to do with the love. There was a clear distinction between the two. And I just wanted to be with the love, especially once you're coming from, our lives, which are often filled with hardships. We look at them in a perspective that keeps us focusing on the negativity and the hardship of it, instead of realizing these are things that will often get us closer to heaven. And can be heaven along the way. My heart condition, it sure seemed miserable when I was going through it, but it was heaven the whole way. I mean, it was actually a beautiful thing.
Yeah, Brian, that's another great part of your story that I want to get into is suffering. The value of redemptive suffering. It's such an important part of the Catholic faith. And that's one of the things I wanted to question you about more in detail later on. So anyway, you eventually turn towards the light. What happens there?
All right, so I see that this light, I see it more clearly because I'm focused only on it. And I see that it's quite a distance off. I couldn't even begin to estimate how far away it was. But I had this thought that I wanted to be with this light. And instantly I was there. I mean, there was no concept of inertia or wind or any kind of other elemental force to give me the idea that I had traveled as quickly as I had. But I covered that distance in a flash, and it was as if I still remembered every step I took to get there. So time was completely out of whack for me. I couldn't even begin to tell you how long I was there. It seemed like I could have been there for years, and it was literally done in just a split second. And I mean, there was nothing on my body that made me feel like I wasn't tired. I didn't have any kind of, exertion or anything like that. So yet I'm standing in front of this light. And, the closer I got to this light, the more powerful that love was emanating. It was penetrating. It was, this love was palpable. It's like just the heat of the sun kind of, where you can just feel it just pouring into your pores. And it was all of those kinds of things combined. It was alive. This light was living. It was this living love that just was penetrating every bit of my soul. And I'm looking at this light, and I could not believe that it didn't hurt my eyes. That was the thing. I mean, if you've ever seen something super bright, even the sun doesn't compare to this, right? But I was staring at it, and it actually felt good to stare at this light. And so I'm trying to find the end of it, because this light was immense. It was, I couldn't even begin to tell you how big it was, because I never did find the end of it. But my vision, I could see that distance from the dark void all the way to the light. Well, I could also see every little step of the way at the same time. But when I'm looking at this light, I'm looking up, and I'm looking to the sides, I'm looking down, all directions at the same time, while also still looking straight on. So I didn't have to focus on anything like that. I could split my focus up, but I could also see that I was traveling the distance trying to find the ends of the light in whatever direction I was going. And yet I'm still looking straight ahead and I'm seeing every little inch that I'm traveling. And I came to the realization I will never find the end of this light. And I'm still staring at him, and I said, "This is God." And I don't know that it was God's physical form or some sort of manifestation of that. I don't want to give the impression that that's what all he is this light. I don't know. I do know that whatever this light is, it's connected to God. It's if it's just his love, well, he is love. So I just don't know how to explain this any more than it's definitely something that God had fully under control, and his love was coming through this light, and it wasn't something separate from him.
Right.
And so he said that I could come into the light. And of course, who's going to waste any time with that? I walked right in. And as soon as I did, that love, that intense love that I was feeling already, more than at the dark void, now it was like uncontrollable. I don't even want to use this as an example, but if you're traveling down like a falls, like a river with just crazy rapids, and the water rushing against you. I mean, if you've ever fallen out of a raft or you've been up against some of that wave, it's a powerful force.
Yeah.
And it can almost be terrifying. Well, this wasn't terrifying, but I realized that this love was so powerful that if it wasn't for how much it loved me, I would be overwhelmed. I wouldn't even be able to handle that much love. That's how much this love was. I have to describe it in this way of drinking from a straw. When you drink the fluid, it's down in the bottom of this cup, and you got this straw, and you fill up the straw, and now it goes down in your mouth and down into your stomach and wherever else. But all the while, it's full in the straw. The straw is as full as it can be. And it's never the same fluid because it's always circulating. It's coming out and then, coming in and going back out. So you're getting new fluid. You're getting this new freshness. And that's what this love was like. It was like God's love was this powerful river rushing into me. And my soul is the straw. And it's constantly full. All the while it's going out because new fluid, new love is coming in. And it's this freshness. And I really felt like his love, I was going to continue to experience it throughout all of eternity as this new freshness of his love, because I will never reach the end of that.
Wow.
It was mind blowing. Of course, my intelligence was much better then. So I wish I would have focused on how to explain this when I came back. I didn't even have a clue that I was going to come back at this point, because he didn't let me see the future, but he was letting me have this intelligence that I understood. I'll never be able to exasperate his love. I will never be able to find the end of that. Think about how vastly different that is than the love we experience here on earth. And that gives you an idea of what this love is like.
Yeah, so that's another one of the questions I want to get to. But I think you have a great little analogy here, because we all struggle with love. Like, what is love that we deal with here? It's such a difficult concept. But you're basically saying that God is love, and he's giving us that love. We just need to receive it and let it through. And the more you receive it, the more it's going to go through.
Yes. I don't even ask God. I do. I shouldn't say I don't do it, but I don't put as much into it as I used to, of asking God to let me love him more, because then it's not perfect love. I want him to love me more. I want to get out of his way and let him really love me, because then I'll be full of his love and I can then give that back out. It's a total flip of what we think as human beings. I've always asked God, I want to love you more. I want to do more for you. I want to do this. But it's I, whereas I want to be gone. I want him. And this is the part that a lot of people really struggle with, but that submitting ourselves to God's will, it wasn't as if I was some just mindless robot. I was fully myself. None of this was forced upon me. But when I realized that I was able to empty myself and have him, that's a far better experience than all the flaws that I bring to this relationship. And yet I'm still fully me, just minus those flaws. That's the beauty
Yeah.
of it. There's just no comparison. It's just, it's our fallen nature that wants us to hold on to this idea that we have some sort of semblance of control. None of us have control. We can't make the sun come up. We can't make it go down or rain or whatever else we want. There's so many things we have no control over, and we have no control over who loves us and how much we love them. These things we can try our best, but it's not within our control to decide who loves us. And yet God loves us, and more than anybody else ever. And why do we fight it?
So what you're saying there is, even when we make an intention to want to love God more, we're just getting in our own way. We have to allow that love to come into us, and that's what's going to, like you said last time, he knows what's best for us, and we need to trust that, right? That's got to be the most incredible experience ever. You're literally standing in the midst of God's light. What's going through your mind? How are you processing that?
Well, there was a lot going through my mind, and particularly all the thoughts and ideas and experiences that have been done in life. I know I've always been fascinated with certain Bible characters, like David. He's always been one of my favorites. Samson, these real powerful heroes of the Bible. I loved them. It was something I grew up loving that. And I know I was experiencing this knowledge of how their lives were, but mostly I was focused on my life and the things that I had done and hadn't. I want to make a very clear statement about how, when I tell this story, it seems very linear. It seems like I'm telling the story in a succession that happened. It all happened at once. This was like being on a pin dot. You poke something with a pin, it's the smallest little hole. Imagine taking everything that's ever happened in the entire history of the world and putting it in that hole. And it's all accessible right now for us as if it was happening then. And it's just all right there. There's no differentiation. So the conversation we had 5 minutes ago is still happening. It's still accessible. It's not like it just ends, and it's not like it just begins when it happens later. It's how we access it. It's far more complex. I don't really understand how it was all there, because I wasn't confused there. I get confused even trying to think about it now. It's that layered. But when I tell the story, it's easier for me to tell it this way because that's how my brain still works, is in our process.
We process things in limited ways, so we wouldn't understand it even if it'd be too much.
Yeah, and it's my brain is unfortunately back to where it was when I died, so I have to tell it the way that my brain works, and it works in a linear fashion. But the thing that really stuck out to me was that among all these thoughts and ideas and feelings and experiences and everything else, God has one thought. He has one experience, and it's Jesus. And contained in Jesus is everything. I mean, it was such a beautiful realization that Jesus is everything. He's God. We can't separate everything that's within God, because if he was to stop thinking about me, I wouldn't even have existence. I realized that I would just go out of existence altogether if he was to stop thinking about me. That's how we're held together. It was all these thoughts were emanated from Jesus. Like, he had created everything, and it overwhelmed me with this love that he had planned out my whole life, all the things that I had done, and he had backup plans for all the times that I deviated from what he had originally intended for me. And he still did it with love for me. It was so overwhelming to know that that's what true love is that he still loves me despite the flaws that I have, despite the outright sins that I had chosen to make against his will. And, I had many justifications for why I did things. Those things didn't pan out. They were complete BS, Can lie to myself just like the rest of us can. And we can justify a lot of things to make ourselves feel better in order to do something that we know we really shouldn't do. And take it another step, and I'll get to that when I talk about my life review, but we really should be aiming for perfection.
Yeah.
And how many of us really try to do that? We're not willing to put aside our own desires to achieve perfection. And once I realized, though, that all of this was about Jesus, that's when I actually want to be with Jesus. I want to see Jesus. And that light opened up. And I'm in this great, big, huge entry room, kind of a greeting room. Some people have said that the way I describe it, that it's like heaven's waiting room, or, it's like this place where you come in and it's the next step in the process. And now this is as far as I got. So I realized, though, when I'm in this room, that this was not all of heaven. And I could see a lot of things. I mean, I could see this beautiful. I got to talk about the atmosphere, because the atmosphere wasn't just like when we breathe the air. Yeah, the air's technically alive, because it keeps us alive, but it's not really the same as it was there. The atmosphere there was a living presence. It was an interconnection, a flow between the light that was encompassing everything, and there was this being in the center of millions or billions or who knows how many beings. I couldn't count. I don't even know how to count that high, right? It was just such an overwhelming amount of beings that were filled with light. They had a torso of a human being, but just filled with light. No physical human being features, but they all had different brilliances of their light, different levels of light. And this one in the middle was so magnificently beautiful and so full of light, every bit as bright as the light that was encompassing us. And this atmosphere was an interplay between all of the beings together. And it really felt as if the way that I was communicating wasn't, auditory. It wasn't like I was hearing things or saying things. It was as if my thoughts were known to everyone else and their thoughts were known to me. And this atmosphere seemed to be somehow related to the connection of that process. And it felt like the love between the light and that bright being. And we can all make for whatever we want out of that. I can't say for sure that it's the Holy Ghost, but that's what I felt like. I wish I would have asked, but I've always had trouble with understanding the Holy Spirit, and I still struggle unless I think of it this way. And I still can't. Who can really explain it? I mean, I think I read this thing about St. Augustine trying to figure out about the Holy Spirit, and he saw this kid on a beach, and the kid was digging this hole and trying to fill it up with water, and get all the water from the ocean to go in this hole. And this little kid says to him, I'm trying to fill the ocean up. And St. Augustine doesn't have a lot of time for little kids. He says, you'll never be able to get all that water in there. And the kid says to him, and neither will you be able to get the fullness of the Holy Spirit into your little human mind. And he disappears. And that's really how I feel. I feel about this whole experience, that there's so much more that I just can't quite articulate, because I don't have the vocabulary to describe heavenly things. And not that any of us have the ability to understand those things fully. So I try to really stick to what I saw and what I focused on, what I had explained to me. But there's so much more that just is there, but I just can't really understand it. And that's one of them. But that being fully understood. And I knew that being was Jesus. I didn't have to have him raise his hand and tell me, hey, Brian, I'm over here. It was as if my whole focus just zeroed in on him. And that's how my experience really has been. Only focused on Jesus. That everything just kept coming right back to Jesus. I mean, from the dark void of knowing that I just wanted to be with him, and it's trying to trick me here, and that's not Jesus. I want to go with Jesus. I mean, everything was this straight line to Jesus.
Wow. So obviously your will was oriented to that, right? That's what we want.
That's exactly what I wish I could have had that my whole life up until this point. I think my experience could have been a lot different. I think that it played out this way because of what I needed to grow, or to not necessarily prove myself, but to prove myself to me of what I really desired. I don't know how to explain it other than that. It's as if, and I got to tell this part too, because with my vision, I could see behind everything. I could see in front of everything. So all these beings, a lot of people ask me how close I was to Jesus. Why didn't I hug him? Why didn't I, kiss him? Why didn't I do all these things? And, you know, honestly, I didn't feel like there was a kind of a personal barrier where he wouldn't allow that to happen. I didn't feel like he was offering it either. So I didn't, but I wasn't presumptive. When I'm looking at him, I'm looking at the king of the whole universe. And I'm very much submitted to him.
So you know that, and that's foremost in your mind. This is the Lord God right there. Wow.
This is who has been holding me in his hand this whole time. I knew that. And I had so much respect for him, so much love for him. But it was, I finally understood what fear and awe is. It wasn't like I was trembling. I would have been if he was angry with me. But it wasn't that. It was this profound respect. And respect doesn't do justice for what I was feeling. But it was just this gratitude for the love that he has for me. This idea that, you think about people serving their king in the back in time, and they're happy to do these things for the duty of the king. I would have done anything for Jesus. I would have been a simple statue that he just looks upon whenever he feels the fancy to do so, and I would have been happy with that. You couldn't get me to do that for a human being. I don't care how much of a hero of mine they were. I wouldn't want to be totally ignored and just at their beck and call for their pleasure. I want to be acknowledged. I want to, we all have that desire to be known and to be respected back. I couldn't have cared less about that because of how wonderfully I knew that I would get it. I could feel how much he loved me, but I really wouldn't have cared if he wanted anything more than to have me be his footstool. In fact, I would have been very happy with that. It would have been a promotion. I would have thought, let me be your footstool. What a great thing. But yeah, so he didn't have to explain that to me, and I could see around, so I could see that I was far away. I can't say that I was the farthest being away. I can't say, I certainly wasn't the closest. But I didn't ever look at my own body either. So I don't know what my body looked like. I don't know what kind of a form I had. I don't know if I had the same form as the other beings that were there or if I was different. I did feel that I had some sort of a containment, but I don't feel like, I know I wasn't oozing around. I had something that was containing me. And for the life of me, I really do wish I would have looked, but that just wasn't the intention. I often think about, I didn't see Mary there, and I have this profound love for Mary more now than I did before, like far more. I really can't explain it. And I think it's because I really felt like that containment that I had was her wrapping her mantle around me,
Wow.
her putting her love around me before her son. And I think this because the way that he was looking at me was full of love. And like I said before, I was going to explain about how when I'm looking at that dark void, that's what I brought, was a bunch of emptiness. I didn't bring anything of value to heaven. All the good deeds that I had done, I did them because I like to do them, and I like to, be known for doing a good deed. I like to do the right thing. I want to be known as a guy who has a high level of integrity and honor. And if somebody's down and out, I'm going to be the one who's going to step up and protect them and help them out. I did that all for me. I could say that, I was doing it because it's the right thing to do and because it serves God. And there is some truth to that. But in essence, I still was getting something out of it. I wasn't selflessly doing it for God.
Yeah, like the Bible said, it becomes its own reward, right? So essentially, you've taken your reward and you're bringing an empty gift.
And then patting ourselves on the back for all the great we did. And look at the gift I'm bringing you,
Wow, that's amazing. In another video interview, you mentioned that you would have been frightened to death if he was angry with you. But you felt that it was Mary's intercession that helped him not be angry with you, right? How did that come about? How did you experience that?
Well, when I was standing there and, contemplating that I wasn't even looking at my body, I knew I wasn't oozing around. I didn't look at my body, and I don't know why I didn't. I wanted to see everything, but I couldn't take my eyes off of Jesus. Everything else just seemed less important to me. But as I'm looking at Jesus, and I'll start the explanation of that question by saying that I was now having my life review. So I was going through everything in my life. And one of the things that came up, which relates to why I believe that this was Mary's mantle around me, is that when I first converted to Catholicism, I had no idea what the rosary was. This is how much of a Protestant I was, that I really had no clue about what Catholics actually did. And I fell in love with the rosary because it's meditating on stories from God's life, from Jesus's life. It's incredible. The mysteries are all related to Jesus. And you can't separate that. And that's what you're praying about. I mean, how beautiful is that? I love to read the Bible, but it's not the same as praying the Bible. And
Yeah.
this is specifically everything about his life that pertains to our salvation. There's no better prayer than the rosary. So I felt totally in love with that. And I started reading everything I could on the rosary because I wanted to see what the saint. I really had a strong attraction to the saints, and I'm talking like not saints so much within the last 100 years. I'm talking, the history of our saints. And but Saint Louis de Montfort has written so many books on the Blessed Mother and the Rosary, and one of the ones that I had read, I think it's called The Mysteries of the Rosary, but it's a little book, and I think it's got a blue cover, but it's got Mary on the front, and I remember reading in there that she had made the promise to somebody, and I'm not sure if it was Saint Dominic or not, but it was somebody who was really devoted to the rosary, that if anybody prayed her rosary, she would intercede for them at their death. I felt like that was true. Like I really felt like this was written specifically for me. I was like, wow, this is something for me. But one of the stories in there was about this king who, he didn't even pray his rosary. He just had it on his belt. And all his servants, he encouraged them to pray. He gave them time to pray and pray their rosaries, and he always encouraged it. But he really was lazy and didn't do it himself, even though he did love God and loved the rosary and Blessed Mother, but he just was lazy. So he dies. 3 days he was dead, and they thought they were going to bury him after the certain time period, but then he came back to life, and he had experienced going before the Lord, and his experience was that he couldn't talk. And the devil was saying, he's mine. He broke these rules. You know it. The law says that I get him, and that was the argument. The Blessed Mother was there and said, but he honored my rosary and encouraged other people to pray it. Wow. And that was all that she had to say. And Jesus says he can go back. And make the long story short, so he goes back, and now he's praying the rosary all the time. And he was really serious about it. But wow, those stories of that book really relate. I really related to that, and I think we all can. But I got into the rosary. I really did. And I knew that promise was true. And it came back to me when I'm having that life review. I definitely think that was one of the saving graces for me, is that I wasn't perfect with my rosary, but I did try to pray my rosary every day. I've definitely increased it again. I used to, when I first got into it, it was like God gave me this consolation to just pray. I couldn't put it down. I was even praying in my sleep sometimes. You fall asleep praying, and then you're still going. And you keep count and everything. It's like, wow, this is incredible. But that only lasts so long. And we got to actually do it ourselves. He gives you a little bit of sweetness, but it's just to strengthen you for when that sweetness isn't there, because he really wants us to love him without that sweetness, because we love him, not because we're getting something in reward. Yeah. So that's where I think that part came in. But as I'm looking at him, I really wanted to see his face. And this again, I don't really understand my motivation for wanting to see his face, because the light was so beautiful. It was everything I needed. I mean, imagine the transfiguration. That's probably what I was seeing. And it was so wonderful. There was something that was, it was almost as if he was inviting me to want to see his face, which is interesting, because as his face came together, because I said, I want to see your face. I said it right to him. I said, Jesus, I want to see your face. And he let me, so his face came together and took on the human form. And at this point, so did all the other beings. So I could see that they were all people that were there. And, I can't tell you whether or not some of them were angels or who they were. I have strong beliefs on who some of the people I saw, but I focused on Jesus, so that's the only thing I can be certain of.
So you didn't interact with any other beings directly?
And although I could hear their words of encouragement, I could understand what they were saying, and it was all in my mind, but I didn't take a time to go and specifically have a conversation with grandma or whoever else. So
Yeah.
because I just really couldn't take my eyes off of Jesus. And so when his face came together, the really startling part of this was that I couldn't remember what his face looked like, even though I'm staring at him. So while I'm looking at you, I can see your reactions. I can see what you're wearing. I can see all these features that you have, but I can remember it. So I can keep playing back that memory. And, it's like if you see a dog, we all know what a dog looks like, and even if I see a dog that's, missing its tail, I realize, well, dogs usually have a tail, so that's probably still a dog because it still has the four legs and the floppy ears. But it fits my pictures in my memory of what a dog looks like. But when it came to Jesus, the fact that I didn't know what he looked like, and now I'm not able to have that memory. So I could see that he's smiling at me. I could see his features. I could see all this detail, and yet I couldn't remember it. It was as if, those animation books where you flip the page and little animation looks like some dude's running down the street, and it was like that, where as soon as the next page came, the first one was already out of my memory.
Wow.
So if he went from smiling to an in-depth loving, kind of acknowledgement look, I wouldn't be able to even remember that change in his face, because I'm now only seeing the one that I was originally seeing. But what was left from my memory is that bright light. So all the while, I'm still remembering the bright light. That's what was being laid down in my memory. So people will ask me all the time, well, did Jesus look like this painting, or did he look like this one? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I think. Jesus probably looks like something like that. But it's more because of something that's holy and inspires me to think of Jesus. That's what I still have as a memory, not because it actually looks like Jesus. I don't know what he looks like.
Incredible.
Yeah, it really is. So all this while, we're going through my whole life review. So all the good. Was that?
So your life review was going on at that time. Was that a terrifying experience or what? That's one of the things I've thought about a lot. That's, I don't know, just seems like a fearsome event where your whole life is there exposed and you really can't defend yourself, right?
No. And honestly, I didn't want to. I couldn't understand why he was still loving me. I mean, I could, because I could see that he's far better than I am. Whereas a human being, I couldn't have love for somebody that has betrayed me so many times. He's far beyond that, and I feel that love. But it was so much different than that. It was upset at the things I had done. I remember even having the justifications at the time for why I could do this and not be a bad thing to do. It was like, these are horrible. That's not even I could see the lie in every situation. And I could see how it had affected Jesus during his passion. What my sins actually had done. And this is the part, on your channel, I'm probably not going to have to worry about it. On a lot of these other channels, people, they really hate the idea of talking about sin.
Yeah.
If I was talking about Hitler and his actions, of course, they're saying, oh yeah, that's a sin. But not for them. They don't want to have that judgment of sin. So they don't even like the word judgment. It's really beyond me on that. But the point is, when we do something that is wrong, it's a sin. And all those people who want to justify, well, I have the right to choose this and choose that, you're not going to think that when you're up before him. You're going to realize how desperate you are for his glory and his love. You have none of that in you. And you're standing before him looking at every justification you had, and you're totally empty of any kind of validation for your actions. Yeah, and so yet he's smiling at me. Keep that in mind. So he's not condemning me to hell. He's not, there was contrition, and I had a lot of contrition in that hospital room. Motivated probably to a point by by the fact that I'm going to die, but probably also motivated by the fact that I wanted to go to heaven and I didn't want to lose that. But I do know there was a very strong motivation that I love God. When
Yeah.
I was dying, I realized how much I love him. And I wished I could have done more. I wish I could have loved him better than I had. And when I'm looking at him like this and he's loving me despite all these things we're going through, I had wished so much that I had done more with my life than I had. And that was, it's still, I think, a beautiful, beautiful part of the experience, because I really think that's why he was so smiling at me and so loving towards me, is because I did have more of a pure heart than I had really thought I did. And it was the removal of all those temptations and all those emotions and all that stuff that clouds up our minds, that I was able to really focus on Jesus. And that's how my experience was. It was complete focus on Jesus. And I remember I had this experience when I was about 6 years old. And I had said that, well, my great grandmother had died, and I had prayed to Jesus, and I had said to him that I didn't want to die early, because I had saw all my aunts and uncles and everybody that I loved crying about my great grandmother. And she was a really beloved member of the family. She was the matriarch, at the time, and everybody loved her. She was the sweetest woman ever. But I was 5 or 6 years old, and I just didn't want my life to be the cause of pain that I saw to the people that I cared about.
And one of the last things you saw leaving your house was the look on your kids' faces.
Yes, it was horrible. Which I'm glad you brought that up, because I often forget to tell this part of it. So I come back to that if I forget to mention again about my kids when I was going out the door. So I prayed and I prayed, and I'm talking for like a 5 or 6 year old. We got home from the funeral was in Iowa. We had to drive back to Minnesota, so it was late at night. You don't get out of a funeral until afternoon.
Yeah.
And so by the time we got out, it was already at home. It was late, so my parents sent me right to bed. And I remember getting out of bed real quick, and I wanted to pray. So I was praying for this, that I would have this long life, so nobody else would have to suffer. My family wouldn't have to suffer my death. And so I prayed for at least an hour. And as a little kid like that, on your knees, that's the first time I ever remember being on my knees. I remember in Sunday school, we'd pray all these little songs, but it was always like, Jesus is going to do what I want. He's going to give me everything I want, and I'm going to be happy, and blah, blah, blah. It wasn't selfless type of prayers that I was taught, but this was a pure prayer. This was the best prayer probably in my whole life, up until my death, when I was dying, because it was just so pure. And I got this feeling that was very similar to the consolation when I was praying the rosaries, and similar to the experience when I was dying and I couldn't pray, and then all of a sudden I was able to pray again. And that closeness I was feeling with Jesus now, it was all very, very much the same. And I'm sure other people can relate to this, because this is the feeling we get when we know a prayer has been answered. And we might not know that at the time. We get this great feeling, but then later when the prayer is materialized and we realize, hey, this was answered, really got my answer to my prayer in my prayer, we know that. We can connect those dots. And so, but that's what I just got, this overwhelming lightness of my soul. Like, all the worry about my family being upset was gone. It was lifted. And I just crawled back into bed and went to sleep. Never thought about it again until this moment when I'm before the Lord.
Incredible.
Yeah. So I had asked him about that. I said, what about this prayer? He's with me. And it's not like he's, I'm just having this thought. He's totally oblivious to what I'm thinking about. He was there with me. He understood everything that I was thinking. And so he immediately tells me, or I just know that he's thinking the same thing, but he says, yeah, I remember that prayer. And I answered it, yes. And it still stands. So it still stood that my death wouldn't be the cause of misery at this time. I knew that he was telling me that I could either stay or go back. But he says, why would you want to go back?
Wow. Wow, that's really incredible, Brian. Our whole life, our goal is to get into heaven, to be in eternal glory with God. And you had an opportunity to choose. What were you thinking? Because you knew what the condition of your body was, right? You got to come back to that. How do you process that? And how did you come to the decision to come back?
Well, when he asked me why would I want to go back, that was all part of it. He didn't hide the fact from me that it's going to be miserable suffering and it's going to be worse than what I had experienced already up to this point. So remember, I had said, please take me. I want to go now. That I've had enough. I gave up at the end. I'm not a person to give up. I have never given up anything in my life. It's uncanny how stubborn I can be. And yet I was understanding fully that I'm going back to something that's going to be worse than what I already had given up on. So
Yeah.
that came into play into my decision, but it still fell back on that thought that I had when I was initially before the Lord, that I wished I could have done more for him because of how much he loved me. That I knew I did all that I could have, that I made choices that were more about me than they were about him. And I wanted nothing to do with that. I wanted to do the opposite. I had the strong desire just from love. And this was from me walking through that love and letting him love me, that I had now had his love in me. And I wanted to do more. I wanted to do more to love him. And so I started trying to think about reasons why I should go back. 'Cause my initial instinct, I think, might have been, I got to try to convince him. Why should I go back? Even though I knew he was already offering it to me, it wasn't this. The question he was giving me was more about, why do I want to go back? He wanted me to come to the realization that I want to do more for him. He wanted me to understand this, because that's the only way that I'm going to be able to endure the suffering I'm going to have to go through.
Yeah.
So he was preparing me for that without just throwing it to me, and there's so much to this. This is a very deep spiritual truth, that I wasn't joking when I said all the suffering that I had on the way to my experience in heaven, it was all heaven. I just didn't see it as heaven when I was going through it the first time, because I looked at it as, well, it's suffering. It's hard to understand. It's hard to wrap your head around. Now, as I'm staring at him and I saw all the suffering he had to go through to save my soul, I realized, wow, suffering is not necessarily a bad thing. There's a lot of good that can come out of this, but it's my way of being more connected to the Lord. I was no longer afraid of the suffering. I was no longer selfish and attached to my own comfort, my own enjoyment, as opposed to the greater glory that we will experience when we reign with Christ in heaven. And so, I did try to throw out, well, my family, they need me. It was connected to that thought about, I don't want my family to suffer. I didn't want my family to suffer. And that's why I want to circle back to that point, is that when I had prayed that prayer for my family when I was a little kid, yeah, he answered that prayer for them, but it's your aunts and your uncles. They don't really care about you as much when you're an adult. I mean, they love you.
Yeah.
My family's great. They love me. But it's not the same as when I was a little kid. That would have hurt them a lot more than when I'm an adult. My parents are a little bit different story, because it's your parents. But he not only answered that prayer for them, he answered them for the family that I didn't even know I was going to have at that time. Because it was those kids and my wife, as I was heading out the door, my kids and my wife's trying to drive back to come and be part of my last few moments, possibly. All of that was what he gave, and he still wasn't going to force me to come back to that horrible suffering he let me know I was going to experience. He was still letting me have the choice at this point, as an adult, as a human being standing there looking at, do I want to stay in eternity or do I want to go back to suffering? Which one do I want to do?
Yeah.
And now, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm happy to die again. I can't wait for it to happen. Although it's going to be in his time, and I don't know what possibly can kill me. If that stuff can't do it, I'm really interested to see what he's got in store that will finally be my demise. I don't know what it will be, but I want it to be his decision. And I luckily get to die twice.
Yeah.
All the rest of us, we get to die once. And when we die, if we accept it and we say, hey, this is the death God had planned for me, what a joyous time. Be proud of that time. Be happy and excited for it because you're going to be with him if you embrace that death. I get to have two of them. So the next one, I'm going to embrace it far better than I did that first one.
That's another really incredible part of your story, is that you're so hopeful. We talked for over an hour in the last video about a lot of suffering and everything you went through, but you just come across as joyful. You weren't bemoaning everything. You talked about some of the hiccups with your medical staff, but you were able to laugh about those things. It shows what a grace that experience must have been. Another thing we connect on is the saints. I just love the lives of the saints. I read the stories about their lives, and there's so much inspiration there, but there's also so much suffering. And the thing that I always wrestle with is, could I undergo something like that? I think I love the Lord, and I love my faith, and I don't think I would ever deny it. And I know if it was, I know I could go a significant way, but, if they start peeling off my skin or roasting me alive, can I do that? And I remember in your book, I think you talked about how the grace of God, the grace that you felt there in heaven, the love that you felt there, enabled you to come back into your body at the end of this experience and forego pain medication. Do you think that that is how the saints are able to endure that type of suffering?
I think love can endure anything. Think about how when we fall in love with another human being, when I fell in love with my wife, I was able to go to work all day, and I was working long hours, tired, and I would come home and have to take a shower and get ready, and I was willing to go out for however long she was going to spend time with me because I just wanted to be around her.
Yeah.
Now that we're married and we're together, I like my sleep. I'm comfortable in the relationship. The love is still there. It's not that strong motivation to suffer every little bit just to be in the presence of someone. And yet, when you're with God, you're willing to suffer anything. Now, that's the love that I want to carry with me. That's the love that when I come back and I talk about no pain medications, that's the love that was residually with me. That couldn't be separated so easily. In fact, the high level of euphoria that I had from that interaction of his love, it was imprinted on me for at least a month. I don't know how much longer it might have been, but it was at least a month. But I just couldn't shake that off. We can get used to our lives again. Like I obviously have, I have to go on and I still have to live 24 hours a day. I have to still be tired. I still have to have all the other experiences. But suffering has changed in such a dramatic way for me because I do it with love. I don't look at suffering as being a punishment, even if it happens to be a test. I don't consider that to be a punishment. I consider that to be another block on my path to heaven. And how can I not rejoice at whatever God puts in front of me that gives me the way to heaven? If I didn't have that block, I fall through. I go right down to the ground and I'm over. But he puts that block there. And if it happens to be suffering, wonderful. I'm stepping on that block, next step all the way closer to heaven. If he gives me something joyful, I'll take that too. And I'm happy with that. Why should I be upset one way or the other? Because I'm not living for this life. I'm living for the next life now.
That's great. All right, let's get back. So you're in front of Jesus, you're having your life review. He gives you this choice. How do you work through that?
It actually didn't take me all that long because he told me right away when I started to throw out the idea of my family needs me. He said, that I love your family more than you do. Let that sink in, right? Because I know as a parent, how I feel about my kids. We love our kids more than our own lives. But here's God, and I knew he wasn't lying because he loves me the same way, but he loves my kids more than I do. Wow. How could I even worry about my kids?
Yeah.
And this has been a blessing for me because this translates into how I have to live my life too, is that, not everybody in our lives are going to have, family and friends. They're not going to have the same level of faith that we do, or even what we think they should have to be able to be saved. It's my job to pray for them, my job to love them and to give them an example, but it is not my job to save them. That's his job. And what I have learned is I just offer that up to him. I don't berate people and say, hey, you got to go to mass all this time. You got to go to confession. I do offer to take people and to encourage them to come with. And kids are a little bit different. I do force my kids, but
Yeah, of course.
but that's because they're kids, so they don't know what's good for them and what's not good for them. But at the same time, I don't try to force people to do this. I just pray for them, and I turn my suffering with it, because it is a suffering for me when I think, hey, you're not really showing God very much love. And I just offer that up to God. I say, you get them to heaven. You figure out how to do it. I'll just take the suffering and I'll apply whatever other sufferings I can. And hopefully that redemptive suffering will be enough to favorably dispose their heart to take the next step. Because it's not about me. I don't have that kind of power. I can't, but I want it. So we often try to get in the way of God by trying to put our own desires, which are not necessarily bad things. It's not a bad thing to want the salvation of somebody we care about, but we just got to let God sort out how that comes to play, because he took his time with me and did it in such a profound way that I could never have planned for the kind of conversion he had in store for me. But yeah, so all of that, where was I at now in the story?
So you were having your life review, and then you thought about the prayer you had as a child and this choice.
My choice was that I realized at this point that the reason I wanted to go back wasn't for my kids now, wasn't for my wife, my people in my job or whoever else I thought might need me, right? The world doesn't really need Brian Hoyland, I realized the reason I wanted to go back is because the world needs Jesus. And I want to be the person who shares his love. I want to do, and that was the right.
That concludes part 2 of this interview series with Brian Hoyland on his near-death experience. The third and final video will focus on the 3 lessons Jesus gave to Brian in order to live his life the way Jesus expects all of us to. You don't want to miss that. You can learn more about Brian's amazing NDE experience in his book, From Sudden Death to Paradise, the story of a near-death experience. You can get it on Amazon.com in both print and digital formats. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Finally, if you have benefited from watching this video, please give it a like and share it with others. This story is too amazing to keep to yourself. So thanks very much for watching, and as always, siempre adelante.